The smell of scorched pasta hit first sharp bitter, like something left too long on heat. Then the photos lit my phone like a flare. A private room at Bella Luna, candles in dusty gold holders, white linen rippling under champagne flutes. My sister stood there in a pale blue dress, one hand on Andrew's sleeve, and the other lifted to show a ring that threw stars on the wall. Behind them, my mother tilted a glass. My father smiled for a camera he had never once pointed toward me, and every familiar face was tucked into the corners like ornaments on a perfect tree. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. The faucet hissed when the pot boiled over water, slapping the burner with a spiteful spit. I didn't move. My thumb kept sliding picture after picture, like I might eventually find myself in one. I saw my aunt, my cousins, even two girls from high school who used to borrow my notes and call me quiet genius with a wink. The cake was custom fondant peonies, blue ribbon, a sugar plaque that read S&A. S&A. Forever, and the caption under my cousin's photo said, "Couldn't love this family more." I dialed with hands that didn't feel like mine, and waited through 3 rings I could count by the throb in my throat. "Olivia," my mother answered like I'd interrupted a nap. I asked the only question that would come out. "You had Sophia's engagement party tonight." There was a pause big enough to walk a lifetime through, and when she finally spoke, the voice was tight as a piano wire. "You have always been the jealous one. We didn't want you making a scene." The burner clicked off. The kitchen went very quiet. Something in me did too. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, especially by your own family, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. But to understand why that phone call split my life in two, you need to know how long I'd been learning to stand in the shadow without shivering. I grew up outside Boston in a house with a maple out front that turned the whole street gold in October. Inside, the breakfast nook was oak and always sticky with jam. The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and my mother's perfume. There was a place for everything except for my feelings. My sister Sophia was the melody in our home piano recitals, choir solos, debate trophies that clinked when the cabinet door shut. I was harmony. No one wrote down an echo they let fade on its own. The first time I realized it, candles were melting themselves into a puddle on my 10th birthday cake, while my father poured champagne for the adults to toast Sophia's surprise first-place win. My mother called every aunt we owned. My friends cut themselves narrow ribbons of cake, not sure where to look. I sat at the edge of my own party and learned how to blow out candles no one was watching. It stayed that way in 1,000 small choices that add up to a life. When I won a scholarship to the Art Magnet High School, my parents missed the ceremony for a choir dress fitting. When we traveled, we followed Sophia's interest museums when my skin wanted sunlight beaches, when I burned raw in 15 minutes. I learned to keep a tube of aloe in my bag and a sketchbook on my lap. If I filled the pages, at least something in the room would be paying attention. My grandmother Eleanor was the only one who saw it without me pointing. She would slip an extra cookie into my palm at Thanksgiving, tuck a folded note into my backpack that said, "You shine so bright, little star." She didn't fix the weather, but she handed me an umbrella and some nights that felt like salvation. Art became the place my voice echoed back to me. I painted eyes that knew things and cityscapes where the light was always leaving but never gone. When the acceptance letter from the Art Institute of Chicago arrived, I opened it alone at my grandmother's kitchen table, the maple outside, coughing up sunlight like confetti. I knew better than to announce it with a trumpet. I told them after the scholarship email came. My father suggested Northeastern so I could live at home and save money. My mother asked what would happen when art doesn't pay the bills. I heard what they weren't saying, stay close enough to clap for your sister, and I said the first no that ever stuck in my mouth. Chicago was 900 miles of air. I could finally breathe. In Chicago, my life resized itself. The city hummed through the windows of a dorm room that barely fit a bed and a box of brushes, and I loved it without conditions. I made friends who asked the kind of questions you answer with your whole body, Zoe, with the pink hair and loud laugh. Maria, who collected thrifted frames. Aiden, who could make a single line look like a whole cathedral. Laura, the creative director at the agency where I interned, pointed at a layout I'd stayed up all night finessing and said, "This is yours. Don't let anyone sand down your edges." I didn't cry, but I could have. Back home, the weekly calls followed a script. My mother's voice warmed on Sophia's name. My father measured pride in bullet points. Sophia graduated law school with honors, started at a firm where the lobby orchids never wilted, began dating a man my parents could introduce without learning how to pronounce anything. I visited for holidays and stood next to centerpieces I hadn't been invited to arrange. The old house kept my high school posters like a museum of a girl who didn't live there, and I slept under evidence that I'd once been easy to overlook. Jack came into the picture at work when the agency hired him for a spring campaign. He wore the same beat-up leather strap on his camera, and a look like he was always looking through things to what they meant. The first time he took me to dinner at his parents' place, every wall had a photo of one of his siblings winning or losing, or just laughing with spaghetti sauce on their chins. His mother asked about my art like it mattered. His father passed bread with a grin and said, "Save room for pie." You don't know you've been holding your shoulders tight until a room makes them drop. And then there was tonight. The burner cooling, the pasta clumping into one sad, starchy sculpture in the sink. The photos still blooming on my screen like I was watering them with my breath. I called my mother. She answered. I named what I saw. She named me jealous. To anyone else, jealous might sound small. In our house, it was the lock that kept the cabinet shut. It turned every grievance into a character flaw and every memory into unreliable narration. My mother's voice grew brisk the way it does when she shifts a place setting a half inch. "We did not want you making a scene," she said, and I was 10 again, frosting soft under my thumbs while someone popped a bottle for my sister's win. I asked what scene she meant, and she reached into a drawer of old nights to find one. "Sophia's 21st, she said. You argued with her in the middle of dinner." That argument had been 3 sentences whispered in a restroom where I cried alone and left without a toast. She brought up the photos at Sophia's law school graduation, where I smiled too small to pass inspection. She didn't mention I had driven 6 hours that morning after a breakup I'd told no one about, because telling would have made it about me. I listened to the shuffling on her end, the rustle of paper, or maybe a napkin, and felt something steady itself inside me. "Then you won't mind missing my wedding too," I said, my voice even enough to stack coins on. She laughed short and bright like a fork against crystal. "You and Jack are not even engaged." I picked my words the way you pick glass out of a cut. "Not yet. But when we are, don't expect an invitation." I hung up because I had to choose between that and drowning. The apartment made the small sounds that remind you you're alive. The radiator ticking like a watch. The freezer nudging itself on. Someone in the alley laughing as a car door thunked shut. I turned the phone face down, and it still felt like it was screaming. The pot in the sink steamed like a ghost of the dinner I'd wanted, not the one I got. I slid down the cabinet like a tired stagehand and sat on the floor with my knees up and my forehead on my wrists. This is the part where people want to fight. They expect you to throw the plate or text a paragraph that burns the wallpaper. In real life, injustice is quieter than that. It's the way your hands won't stop shaking, even after you set the phone aside. It's the click in your jaw when you remember how beautiful your sister looked in that blue dress, and you want to be happy for her, and also want to be anyone else for 5 minutes. It's the drip from the faucet that lands, and none of the drops belong to you. A photo buzzed through from a cousin who forgot to take me off a list. It was the custom cake with the little gold plaque and a caption of hearts. The room wobbled. I pushed the phone away with 2 fingers like it might be hot enough to scar. In the living room, my sketchbooks lined the shelf by color. A draft for a campaign lay open on the coffee table, margins full of thumbnails and arrows and notes in my neat pen. The work was good. My life was good. None of that shifted the fact that 300 miles away, a room full of people who share my name had decided I was too dangerous to be present for my sister's happiness. My first thought was to call Jack, but the part of me that keeps score against myself whispered that I was being dramatic, and I told it to hush like you shush a child in a theater. The heat kicked on with a rush through the vents. I stood up and turned every knob on the stove to off again, as if a second twist might undo something bigger than a burner. When the key hit the lock an hour later and Jack's camera bag dropped with its usual soft thud, I was still in the kitchen, still on the tile floor, hair pinned back with a pencil I'd grabbed without thinking. He crouched, looked at me like I was a person and not a problem to be solved, and brushed the back of his hand along my cheek where the salt had dried. "What happened?" he asked, and I opened my mouth and told the truth out loud. I told him about the photos and the cake and the caption and the word jealous, like a stamp pressed hard enough to bruise. I told him about the 10th birthday I never got back and the graduation I had smiled through, and the way a blue dress could be both a beautiful thing and a blade. He didn't interrupt to tell me maybe they didn't mean it, or your mom or families are complicated. He listened until the room stopped spinning, and when I was done, he said softly and with a steadiness I wanted to borrow, "They have no idea who you are." "I do." I leaned into the cabinet and let that sentence hold me up. Outside, a siren blurred past and sank back into the city. In here, the clock over the stove blinked 9:41 in stubborn green. My phone, face down on the counter, might as well have been a hive. I knew if I turned it over, there would be more photos, more hearts, more proof that my absence improved the composition. I reached up, flipped the phone, and pressed my thumb to the screen. The call history glowed. My mother's name. My father's missed text. "We need to talk." A cousin's message I didn't open. I scrolled past them with the same calm you use to pull a splinter, then blocked the numbers I needed to for silence to take hold. The device went still in my palm. The radiator sighed, as if the room itself had been waiting for that choice. I set the phone next to the cold pot and stood. The kitchen window fogged at the corners winter, trying to get in one last word. Down on the street, someone clipped their leash to a dog and crossed under the streetlight. I watched their shadows slide over the snow like 2 long stitches. Tomorrow would bring explanations I wasn't ready to hear, and questions I couldn't answer without bleeding. Tonight brought a chair, a glass of water, and the kind of quiet that gets mistaken for peace because it isn't loud. I turned off the last light, the blue from the phone, the only glow left, and in that small, tender, dark one, thought arrived with the certainty of a door closing. If they could throw a party without me, I could learn how to live without them. The heater shuddered once, then settled. I stood very still in the hush that followed the kind of hush that makes you hear your own heartbeat, and felt the first cool edge of distance begin to form. The night stretched long after that call. Sleep didn't come, only the low hum of the city pressing through the window and the sound of my thoughts circling like restless birds. When dawn finally cracked pale against the blinds, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee I couldn't taste, staring at the phone I'd already silenced. I'd blocked my parents' numbers before midnight, but it didn't quiet the noise they left behind. Jack moved carefully that morning, giving me space the way you'd handle a wounded thing you didn't want to scare. He made breakfast anyway, the kind of simple gesture that can keep you from unraveling completely. When I finally spoke, my voice came out thin. I told him I needed to talk to someone who would remind me what was real. He nodded without asking who. By noon, I had an appointment with my therapist. The office was on the 10th floor of an old brick building near the river, its windows fogged from the cold. Dr. Fisher greeted me the way she always did, warm, but measured her eyes steady behind round glasses. She listened as I told her everything: the photos, my mother's words, the hollow space that had opened inside me. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees. "What your mother said," she began, "wasn't just unkind. It was gaslighting." The word landed like a soft thud on the rug between us. "You've spent your life being told your feelings are the problem. They aren't. You're reacting to unequal treatment, not inventing it." I looked at my hands, pale against the mug she'd offered, and felt something loosen, just a fraction of the grip I'd been holding on my own heart. Still, when I left her office, the city felt too big. The cold wind cut down the street, and I pulled my scarf higher. I didn't feel free. I felt exposed. On the walk home, I kept replaying my mother's tone, the certainty in it, the way she'd made me sound like a threat at my own sister's celebration. I told myself it was done, that blocking them meant peace. But peace doesn't arrive just because you tell it to. At work, I buried myself in projects. I stayed late taking extra assignments, losing hours to colors and fonts and client briefs. My boss, Laura, stopped by my desk one evening after most of the office had gone dark. "You've been here every night this week," she said gently. "Whatever's eating at you, it's not worth burning out over." I smiled, or tried to. "Just easier to think here," I said. She studied me a moment, then gave a small nod. "Make sure you remember to live outside of the work, too. You're allowed." But nights were harder. That's when the doubts came crawling back, whispering that maybe I really had been the jealous one, the dramatic one, the problem. Jack tried to break the loop in quiet ways. He'd come home with takeout from my favorite Thai place, or tug me out for a walk along the lake when the insomnia got bad. On those nights, the air off the water was cold enough to sting, and he'd slip his hand into mine, steady and sure. "You're not alone in this," he'd say. And for a while, I could almost believe him. 3 weeks after that night, Jack told me to pack a bag. "No work, no phone, no social media," he said as we loaded the car. "Just a few days to breathe." The highway stretched flat and empty out of the city, the skyline fading behind us like a watercolor washed in rain. By afternoon, we reached a small cabin near Lake Michigan. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. Firewood stacked neatly by the porch wind, sighing through the pines, and the lake murmuring just beyond the dunes. We spent Saturday hiking narrow trails threaded with early spring green. The air smelled of damp earth and thawing roots, the kind of scent that hints at renewal before you quite believe in it. Jack carried his camera, but barely used it. That evening, we walked the shore as the sun bled into the horizon orange and rose fading into the gray-blue water. The sand was cool beneath our shoes, the waves brushing the edges of our footprints. He was quiet for a long while before he spoke. "I've been thinking about what makes a real family," he said, his voice almost lost under the wind. I glanced at him, curious. "And what have you figured out?" He stopped walking, turned toward me with that steady look that always feels like a hand on the back. "That family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you, who sees you for who you are, and loves you anyway." His eyes caught the last glint of sunlight. "That's what I want to build with you." Before I could speak, he dropped to one knee. I remember the sound of the waves, the soft scrape of his shoe on the sand, the way his fingers trembled as he opened the small velvet box. The diamond caught the sunset and threw it back at me in tiny sparks. Olivia, he said quietly, you are the bravest, kindest person I know. Will you marry me? My breath broke into a laugh, or maybe a sob. It was hard to tell. Yes, I said once, then again, louder. Yes. When he slid the ring onto my finger, it fit, as if it had always been waiting there. For the first time in weeks, the heaviness in my chest lifted. I felt chosen, not compared, seen, not measured. We drove back to Chicago Sunday evening. As soon as we walked through the door, the lights flicked on, and a chorus of cheers erupted. Zoe had guessed everything. Our apartment was strung with fairy lights, the coffee table crowded with champagne and takeout boxes. Finally, she shouted, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. Our friends toasted, laughed, made bad speeches, and danced in their socks across the rug. It was imperfect and chaotic, and exactly what joy is supposed to feel like. In the days that followed, life took on a different hum. Jack and I spent evenings talking about wedding plans, small ceremony, close friends, a setting that felt alive. We both loved the idea of the botanical garden where we spent so many Sunday afternoons surrounded by wildflowers and quiet paths. It felt honest, like us, but beneath all that excitement, a shadow lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the absence, about who wouldn't be there. One night, while we were sketching ideas for the ceremony on the dining table, Jack closed his laptop and looked at me. Have you thought about whether you want to invite your family? He asked gently. I didn't answer right away. The question sat between us like a stone. Part of me still wanted them there, or maybe wanted the idea of them there, the version of my family that existed only in the photos on other people's walls. Maybe if they saw me this happy, this whole, they'd understand what they'd lost by pushing me away. But another part of me, the part that had learned the hard way, knew what would follow. The criticism disguised as concern, the smiles that never reached the eyes, the feeling of shrinking just to fit in the picture. I traced the edge of my mug and shook my head. I don't think I can, I said quietly. Not this time. I can't spend my wedding day wondering what I did wrong. Jack nodded, his expression soft. Then we don't. This day is about joy, not survival. His hand covered mine, solid and warm. The decision felt both right and heavy. Freedom always does. Still, the guilt found ways to creep in. At night, lying in bed, I'd picture the empty chairs where my parents should have been, or my grandmother's old brooch on a table somewhere in Boston untouched. I'd wonder if I was being cruel or just cautious. The line between the two can blur when you've spent a lifetime apologizing for needing love. When Jack took me home to meet his family again, this time as his fiancée, the difference nearly undid me. His mother hugged me with tears in her eyes. His father clapped Jack on the shoulder and said, "About time." His sisters argued playfully over who'd host the bridal shower. The house was full of noise and warmth, the kind that seeps into you like sunlight through old windows. I sat at the dinner table listening to their laughter and felt something ache deep inside, a grief for what I never had and a gratitude for what I'd found. That night, lying in the guest room, I cried quietly into the pillow. Not for the past exactly, but for the child in me who had never known this kind of belonging. Jack didn't ask why when he found me awake. He just held me until the tears ran out. "You're building your own family now," he whispered, and I nodded into his chest, trying to believe that healing could be as simple as beginning again. Days later, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Aunt Elaine, the aunt who'd always been kind but careful, I hesitated before listening. Her voice was warm, familiar. She'd heard I was engaged, she said, and wanted to see me while she was in Chicago for a conference. "Coffee, maybe?" she added. I nearly deleted it. She had been at that engagement party. I'd seen her in the photos, smiling under those same golden lights. but curiosity or maybe hope won out. I texted her back the next morning and agreed to meet. Maybe I just needed to know if anyone back home still saw me as more than the jealous sister who made scenes that never happened. I spent the following week in a quiet unease, half expecting regret to knock at my door. Instead, I found myself thinking about the lake, the sand under my feet, the moment Jack asked, and I said yes. The memory carried a steady calm I hadn't known before, a reminder that peace could be chosen like anything else. Still, when I walked into that small cafe near my office, a few days later, heart knocking in my chest, I wasn't sure what to expect. Aunt Elaine was already there, her coat draped over the chair beside her, a coffee cup half empty on the table. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt toward my family in years, the faintest trace of home. That was the beginning of something I didn't yet have a name for, something that would change everything I thought I knew about why my family became what it was. The cafe was quiet that morning, sunlight cutting through the tall windows and turning the dust in the air into small floating stars. Aunt Elaine looked up from her cup as I walked in, her face softening into a smile that didn't need words. She stood, pulled me into a hug that smelled faintly of cinnamon and floral perfume, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. It had been years since a member of my family had touched me without tension behind it. We sat near the window, the hum of conversation low around us. "Let me see it," she said, her eyes dropping to my left hand. I held it out, and the diamond caught a shard of sunlight, scattering light across the table. She smiled the way mothers do when their children finally find happiness. "Jack has good taste," she said quietly. I nodded, unsure what else to offer. "How did you hear?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "Zoe posted pictures," she said. "Your mother doesn't know yet. She and I haven't been talking much." That caught me off guard. I had always thought of my mother and Elaine as a matched set, two sides of the same careful coin. "What happened?" I asked. She stirred her coffee, looking down into it like it held something she couldn't say out loud. "We disagreed," she said at last, "about how certain people are treated in our family. Specifically you." The words settled over the table like a soft blanket, heavy with warmth and regret. For the first time in years, I felt the air shift. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding in until it all came rushing out. I told her everything, the party, the phone call, the accusations that had bruised deeper than they sounded. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix or justify. She just listened, her hand resting quietly over mine. When I was finished, she let out a breath that trembled a little. "I knew about the engagement party," she admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I've regretted that every day since." We sat in silence for a moment. The clatter of dishes and the hiss of the espresso machine filled the quiet between us. "There are things you don't know," she said finally. "Things that might help you understand, even if they don't excuse what's happened." Her voice was steady, but I could feel the weight behind it. She told me about the months after I was born, how my mother had fallen into a deep, unspoken darkness. How she barely left the bedroom, how my father had clung to Sophia, the older child, who still smiled and asked for cereal in the mornings. "He adored her," Elaine said, eyes fixed on the steam curling up from her cup. "It was part necessity, part escape. And when your mother came back to herself, she followed his lead." By then, Sophia was the center of their world. The pattern was set. I listened, my stomach tightening around each word. It didn't erase the pain, but it explained the shape of it, the cold logic behind years of imbalance. "That doesn't make it right," Elaine said quickly. But maybe it helps you see it wasn't about something wrong in you. I nodded, though it took effort to swallow. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. Do you think they can change? I asked quietly. She looked at me for a long time before answering. People can change, she said, but only if they're willing to look at what's broken. Your parents? I don't think they're there yet. Sophia might be. Her eyes softened again, and she reached into her purse. I was going to wait, but she pulled out a small envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was an invitation to our wedding, the one Jack and I had designed together, white paper, edged with watercolor strokes of the Chicago skyline at sunset. We'd love to have you there, I said. It surprised me how much I meant it. Tears gathered in her eyes as she traced the embossed lettering with one finger. I'd be honored, she whispered. Truly honored. When we hugged goodbye, her coat brushed against my cheek, and I caught that same scent of home I hadn't realized I missed. I walked back to my office feeling lighter, though not entirely at peace. Some wounds don't close cleanly. But there was comfort in knowing at least one person in my family still had a pulse of empathy. That comfort didn't last long. The next evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Elaine. I'm so sorry. Your mother knows. I let it slip when she asked about Chicago. My stomach twisted as I read the words again. She knows now. I showed the message to Jack when he came in from work. He leaned against the counter, considering. Maybe this is a good thing, he said carefully. Maybe it's time they face what they've done. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew my family didn't face things. They rewrote them. The call came at dawn. I stared at the screen as my mother's name lit up, then went dark, then lit again. Jack stirred beside me, whispering, You don't have to answer. But I did. Some habits die slower than others. Her voice came through, already breaking. Olivia, she cried, how could you get engaged and not tell us, your own family? The sound of her sobs tugged at a place I'd thought I'd boarded shut. How could I said, quietly. You threw a party for my sister and didn't tell me it existed. Her crying turned sharp defensive. That's different. We didn't want drama. You always find a way to make it about you. Something snapped inside me, not loudly, but with the clean precision of glass under pressure. I've spent my entire life not making things about me. I said, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. I've stepped aside, kept quiet, pretended it didn't hurt. You've mistaken silence for peace. She scoffed. We treated you and Sophia equally. I laughed, a hollow sound that didn't feel like mine. Name one time you put me first, I said. The line went quiet. I could almost hear her searching, flipping through old years for something that didn't exist. When she finally spoke, her tone had hardened. So this is your revenge, excluding us from your wedding. I closed my eyes. This isn't revenge, I said softly. It's protection. I deserve a day that doesn't hurt. I ended the call before she could answer, my hands trembling, the silence around me heavy but clear. An hour later, my father called. His voice carried that calm, managerial tone he used when closing deals. Your mother's upset, he began. I think this has gone far enough. I let him speak. He talked about family unity, about perspective, about how we all see childhood differently. Sophia has her complaints too, I'm sure, he said. You need to move past it, I asked quietly. Has she ever felt forgotten? He hesitated. Well, no, he admitted, but that's not the point. It's exactly the point, I said. The conversation spun in circles until I realized he wasn't listening, only waiting for his turn to talk. I hung up before he could finish his sentence. By evening, Sophia called. Her tone was sharper than I'd expected. "What did you do?" she asked. "Mom's a wreck. Dad's furious. You've turned the whole family upside down." I took a breath, steady and deep. "All I did was say no," I said. "No to another day where I disappear." She sighed. "You could have just told them you were engaged." I closed my eyes. "Like they told me about your engagement party?" The silence on the line was long and heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. I knew she said finally, "Mom said it was better that way. That you'd start an argument." I felt the ache rise behind my ribs, slow and deep. "We weren't arguing," I said quietly. I hadn't even spoken to her. Another pause. Then barely above a whisper, I should have called you myself. It was the first time I'd heard her voice carry regret. For a moment, I let that sink in. We talked for nearly 2 hours after that, about childhood memories, about the cracks we'd both ignored. She asked questions she'd never asked before, what it felt like to be the one standing in the shadows. I told her the truth, that it was lonely, not just in the quiet moments, but in the constant pretending. She didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled. "I never realized how different it was for you," she said. "I thought Mom and Dad were just proud of me. I didn't know what that meant for you." "None of this was your fault," I said. "We were kids. We didn't choose the roles we were given." She sniffed softly, the sound of someone trying to keep dignity and failing a little. "I want to do better," she said. "I don't want this to be who we are." We ended the call without promises, but with something fragile taking shape between us, something that looked a little like understanding. When I put down the phone, the city outside my window was washed in the last light of evening. Jack walked over, kissed the top of my head, and didn't ask what was said. I leaned into him and closed my eyes. Somewhere inside, the anger had burned itself down to embers. What was left wasn't peace exactly, but the beginning of it, the faintest sense that truth once spoken aloud changes the air it touches. A soft rain had fallen overnight, leaving the streets outside silvered and quiet. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, the weight in my chest had settled into something steadier, a kind of stillness that comes when you've already said what needed saying. Jack moved through the apartment quietly, slipping his tie into place before work. He didn't ask about the night before. He didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken out loud, and once it's spoken, it never quite fits back into silence. The next few days blurred into each other. My phone buzzed, constantly texts from cousins, distant relatives, old family friends. Some messages were kind, cautious, the way people talk when they don't know the full story but want to sound fair. Others were harsher, dressed up as concern, but dripping with judgment. "Family is everything. You'll regret this. Your poor mother." Each one landed like a pebble in water, rippling outward, never deep enough to drown, but enough to make me ache. Jack's parents called every evening, checking in. His mother's voice carried the kind of warmth that wraps around you when the world feels cold. "You're doing the right thing, honey," she told me one night. "A wedding should be about love, not damage control." Her husband, quiet but steadfast, added from somewhere in the background, "Family is supposed to lift you up, not weigh you down. If they can't see that, they don't deserve the front row." Their kindness felt like sunlight after a long winter. But even light can sting when you're not used to it. I thanked them, meaning it, and hung up with tears I couldn't explain. I wasn't crying from sadness, exactly, more from the strange relief of being defended without having to earn it. Planning the wedding helped anchor me. Every detail felt like a small act of defiance wrapped in joy. We chose soft wildflowers, bluebells, daisies, lavender, nothing stiff or formal. The garden pavilion at Lincoln Park was perfect, its glass ceiling catching the light like a prism. We decided on live acoustic music instead of a DJ, and Jack's sister offered to bake our cake. Every piece of it was shaped by care, not control. I could feel the difference. Still, peace has a way of testing you. 3 weeks after the confrontation, my phone rang again. Sophia this time. Her voice sounded hesitant, fragile around the edges. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began. "About how different things were for us growing up. I talked to Aunt Elaine and—" Her words trailed off before she found her footing again. "I think you were right, Liv. I went through our old photo albums, and it hit me every picture, every celebration you were there, but never in the center. It's like you were the one taking the photos instead of being in them." I pressed my palm to my eyes, the memory of those albums flickering behind my lids. "That's how it felt," I said softly. She let out a long breath. "I'm coming to Chicago next weekend," she said. "Just me. No mom, no dad. Can we talk? Really talk?" When I hung up, I just sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the city lights. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but part of me wanted to believe people could change, if not the past, then at least their place in the present. The following Saturday, the sky was the color of porcelain, thin and cool. I met Sophia at a quiet restaurant near my apartment, one with low lighting and tables spaced far enough for honesty. She arrived early, her posture careful, her smile uncertain. It struck me how much she looked like me when I used to brace for disappointment. For a while we talked about safe things, the weatherwork, how fast the city changes. Then slowly, the conversation bent toward the past. She admitted that she had been aware in fleeting moments of how differently our parents treated us. It was like a current I didn't question, she said. They made it feel normal. Her eyes met mine, watery and steady at once. "I'm sorry, Liv. I benefited from it, and I never stopped to think about what that cost you." I wanted to stay angry, but her voice carried something that sounded like truth. "It wasn't your fault," I said after a moment. "We were kids. We didn't assign the roles, we just played the ones we were given." She smiled small and sad. "Maybe it's time we write new ones." For the first time in years, I saw her not as the golden child, but as another woman trying to find her way out of an old script. We laughed at things that once hurt too much to name Dad's endless praise for her piano recitals, Mom's sharp comments about my little art hobby. By the time dessert came, the heaviness between us had thinned into something tender. When the plates were cleared, she folded her napkin slowly, as if rehearsing courage. "About your wedding," she said. "I understand why Mom and Dad aren't invited. But would you consider letting me come? I don't want to take attention or make things harder. I just want to be there for you." Her words hung there, delicate as glass. I studied her face, the hope and hesitation mixed together. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "Jack and I need to decide together." She nodded, relief flickering through her expression. "Whatever you decide, I'll understand," she said. "But I'm trying, Liv. I want to be the sister you deserved." When we hugged goodbye, it wasn't the stiff, polite embrace of holidays past. It felt real, unsteady, but genuine, like the first step on unfamiliar ground. As she walked away, a small part of me realized I didn't feel invisible anymore, just cautious. Back home, Jack listened quietly as I told him everything. He didn't push one way or another, just took my hand and said, "Whatever choice lets you breathe easy, that's the right one." His steadiness has always been my compass. That night, lying beside him, I weighed the decision until sleep took it from me. In the end, I decided not to invite her. Not out of bitterness, but because I needed this day to stand untouched by old stories. When I told her, she didn't argue. "I understand," she said simply. "Maybe someday." The morning of the wedding arrived soft and golden sunlight filtering through the leaves of the garden. The air smelled of lilac and new beginnings. Zoe fastened the last button on my dress while humming under her breath. My hands trembled not from nerves, but from something gentler, an awareness that I had made it here on my own terms. As I stepped into the garden, music swelled softly from the small quartet near the archway. The path was lined with wildflowers, their colors muted in the morning light. Jack waited at the end of the aisle, his eyes steady, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Every seat was filled with faces that had chosen to be here, friends, mentors, his family. Not one person out of obligation. Halfway down the aisle, movement caught my eye. At the very back, Aunt Elaine slipped quietly into the last row, holding a small wrapped box against her chest. Our eyes met for an instant, and she smiled a kind of gentle permission. My steps didn't falter, but something warm rose behind my ribs. The ceremony itself unfolded like a dream written in real time. We spoke our vows beneath a ceiling of glass, the morning light catching the edges of every word. When Jack said, "You are my home," I felt the truth of it down to my bones. During the reception, laughter carried over the soft notes of music. Elaine approached me, the same box still in her hands. "I have something for you," she said, her voice unsteady. "From your grandmother." Inside was a small wooden chest carved with birds and flowers worn smooth from age. Beneath a stack of old photographs and report cards was a sealed envelope in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. I unfolded it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Her words were simple but sure. "You were never invisible to me, Olivia. I saw your light even when others looked away. You will build the family you deserve. Love deeply and don't dim yourself for anyone." By the time I finished reading, my tears had blurred the ink. Jack reached for my hand, grounding me back to the moment. Elaine explained softly that my grandmother had given her the box before she passed, with instructions to deliver it when Olivia needs it most. I could only nod, unable to find my voice. She hesitated, then pulled another envelope from her purse. "This one's from your mother," she said. "She asked me to give it to you. You don't have to read it now." I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, the kind that can break you or free you depending on when you open it. I slipped it into my bag, deciding to wait. Later that night, as twilight settled and lanterns flickered to life above the garden, Jack and I stood together beneath the trees, watching our friends laugh and dance. The air was thick with music and the smell of lilacs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder to see who wasn't there. I thought of my grandmother's letter, of Sophia's voice on the phone, of my mother's envelope still unopened. There would be time for all of it. But not tonight. Tonight, I chose to stand in the light of the life I'd built, the one no one could take credit for but me. Somewhere beyond the laughter and the music, a night breeze moved through the garden, cool and sweet, and I knew something was shifting. Not the past, but what I carried from it. Something old was letting go, and something new was just beginning to take root. The morning after our wedding felt like the world had exhaled. The rain that brushed through the city overnight left the air sharp and clean, the kind that smells faintly of wet stone and lilac. Jack and I sat barefoot on the porch of our small apartment, 2 mugs of coffee between us, the garden flowers from yesterday already beginning to droop in their vases. The laughter, the music, even the soft applause that had carried through the night, all of it had faded into a memory that hummed quietly under my skin. When I reached for the unopened envelope on the table beside me, the paper had softened at the edges from being carried around all night. I turned it over in my hands, tracing my mother's careful handwriting. Jack didn't say anything. He just set his cup down and rested his hand on my knee, a silent promise that I didn't have to read it alone. The letter was longer than I expected. Her words were deliberate, each one chosen like a stone placed into a path. She wrote about the years she couldn't face, about postpartum shadows, and the way small patterns turn into walls. She didn't excuse herself, not this time. She called me by name, my Olivia, and told me she finally understood what she had done by pretending everything was fine. She wrote that she believed me now, that she was sorry for every time she had told me I was too much or not enough. At the end, she said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that when you think of me, it won't always hurt." I folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope. For a while, we just sat there, the sound of the street below mixing with the faint song of a mourning dove. I didn't know if forgiveness was the right word for what I felt. It was quieter than that, more like a tide receding, leaving behind something still and bare, but ready for new things to grow. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its ordinary rhythm, the one I'd built myself. Work at the agency picked up again, and I found joy in the quiet routines of married life. Jack's laughter filled our kitchen most mornings, his camera resting on the counter beside my sketchbooks. We started taking walks after dinner, tracing the same neighborhood route until it felt like part of our story. Some evenings, we'd stop by the lake, watch the skyline reflect on the water, and talk about the future like it was something we could build with our hands. A few months later, an email from my mother arrived, short, careful, almost shy. She wrote that she'd been reading about family therapy, that she wanted to understand how to show love differently. She didn't ask to visit, she only asked if she could write again. I replied simply, yes. It became a slow, steady rhythm, letters, then emails, then phone calls every few weeks. We learned to talk without tearing old wounds open. Sometimes she shared small things, what flowers were blooming in her yard, how my father had started cooking dinner on Sundays. Other times, the words grew heavier, and she'd pause to collect herself before admitting she was still learning how to listen. When she and my father visited Chicago nearly a year later, the air between us felt cautious but kind. We met at a quiet cafe by the river. My father, always the man of composure, looked smaller somehow, his confidence softened by time and recognition. He apologized without long speeches, just one sentence that landed gently between us. "I should have seen you live. I'm sorry I didn't." It wasn't a sweeping reconciliation, but it was real. The kind that grows slow and stays. Sophia visited often after that. She'd bring pastries from a local bakery, laughing as she wiped powdered sugar from her fingers. Our conversations became easier about work, about love, about what it meant to unlearn a childhood that shaped us both. Once she said, "It's strange, isn't it? How we spent years believing we were in different stories, but it turns out it was the same one all along." By the second spring after our wedding, the air in our home had changed. Jack and I had moved into a small house near the lake, a creaky, sunlit place with a screened porch and enough room for an art studio. On Sunday mornings, we'd leave the windows open and let the wind carry in the sound of church bells from a few blocks away. I hung my grandmother's letter above my desk, its edges curling slightly with time, a quiet reminder of everything she had seen before anyone else could. When our daughter was born the following summer, we named her Eleanor. Her hair came in soft and dark, her eyes a calm shade of blue-gray that reminded me of morning rain. The first night home, as she slept in her crib beside us, I felt something lift inside me, a promise I didn't need to say aloud. She would never have to wonder if she was enough. Family, I learned, isn't a fixed thing. It changes shape, bends, and mends itself in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's made of the people who share your blood. Other times, it's the ones who choose to stand beside you when everything else falls away. The first Thanksgiving we hosted, the house was full of both kinds. Jack's parents carved the turkey while my mother set out the silverware, her movements quiet but certain. Sophia helped Zoe arrange flowers down the center of the table, laughing when they ran out of vases and started using coffee mugs instead. My father offered to make a toast, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to those who make us brave enough to start them." The words hung in the air, tender and true. I met my mother's eyes across the table, and this time she didn't look away. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The night was cool, the sky washed in silver light from the moon. Through the window, I could hear laughter, familiar, layered, alive. I thought of all the years I'd spent waiting to be seen, waiting to be chosen. I hadn't realized that choosing myself first was what made it all possible. Forgiveness hadn't been a single act. It had been a slow unfolding. A letter, a phone call, a quiet meal shared without defenses. Peace didn't rush in. It crept in softly, one honest word at a time. Sometimes I still catch myself looking at my daughter and thinking of my grandmother's handwriting. "You will build the family you deserve." She was right. It didn't happen through perfection or promises. It happened through truth and time. Now, when I paint, I find myself reaching for lighter colors, soft yellows, pale blues, a bit of green for hope. My hands move slower, steadier. The canvases line the studio wall, sunlight spilling over them like something newly forgiven. The old wounds don't ache the way they used to. They've turned into stories, and the stories have turned into strength. I still keep that letter from my mother in a drawer by the window, folded neatly beside one from Eleanor's first birthday, a photo of her scribbled handprint in bright red paint. 2 generations apart, bound by something better than apology understanding. The years keep moving forward, but the peace stays. It lives in quiet mornings and laughter that doesn't hide behind politeness. It lives in boundaries kept without bitterness, in the small joy of knowing who you are when no one else is watching. As I close the window each night, the city hums softly beyond the glass, a reminder that even in the noise, peace can belong to you if you protect it. Some wounds don't fade because we forget them. They fade because we finally stopped carrying them like proof. If this story found a place in your heart, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever learned to make peace with your past, I'd love to hear how. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength healing and second chances. And remember, you are enough exactly as you are. Always have been. Always will be.